and we're all set. So I'm going to start a new lecture series with you today. And I'll be honest with you, I have slight trepidations about this because I'm going to talk about something that very directly concerns and affects you. And that is what I'm calling the lifespan revolution. And to put it in its simplest terms, human beings are living far longer than they have ever lived in the past. And when I say far longer, we're living more than twice as long as the average human lifespan had been up until around 100 years ago. So of our hundreds of thousands of years of human history, from that entire period until yesterday, we tended to live 30 to 40 years. Now that's a little bit distorted because a lot of the average is dragged down by high rates of infant mortality, but but it is nevertheless the case, and I'll show you with data in just a moment, that we are in the middle of a vast social transformation. And it's one that I don't think we spend enough time thinking or talking about. And so I do want to spend some time thinking through these issues. And so this is a lecture series that I'm going to start. And I plan to do this over the next couple months to be as clear as possible. I will come up for air and talk about contemporary politics every now and then. The fiasco around the appointment of Kevin McCarthy as the Speaker of the House that unfolded over the last week is a point in case. And I will be very brief about that and just say it's not, I think, really. I heard one of the members of Congress saying that she was going to get her popcorn. That was on Monday, right? She had to get a lot of popcorn to make it through the week. But I don't think we should just, take amusement from the spectacle of the party that I gather most of us have little sympathy for, floundering in its effort to do the very first and minimal procedural thing they had to do, which was to appoint a speaker. Somebody pointed out that Nancy Pelosi never went to the floor of the House without having all her votes counted and lined up. And here in his very first effort, Kevin McCarthy shows that he is not going to be that kind of speaker. And the issue here, of course, is this restive caucus, the caucus of chaos, the so-called Liberty Caucus within the House of Representatives that grows out of the Tea Party, maybe even out of the earlier Gingrich Revolution, and that really does not want McCarthy's speakership to be successful, because I think they correctly understand that McCarthy will continue to try to do something along the lines of mainstream legislating, and they don't want the Congress to be an effective instrument of legislating. And so to take the most pressing issue, that would be the debt ceiling, which has to be increased this summer. We don't know precisely when yet. They are in favor of the United States defaulting on its good faith and commitments, its Treasury bonds, because they think that will be the best way to rein in the growth of the federal government, to undercut its capacity to fund its operation through issuing debt. Needless to say, I think most sane analysts think that this would be an unmitigated disaster, not only for the United States and its capacity to sustain a 21st century government, but also for the world economy. It would our bonds are the most stable, secure asset held by foreign governments and bond funds and traders all over the world. You undermine the value of that, you're going to bring about, or at least risk the collapse of the world economy. So I really don't think we should be primarily amused, but frightened by the dysfunction. And the second aspect of this is that Kevin McCarthy has already shown himself to lack the capacity to discipline his own party's members. That the way he got to be speaker last night, or I guess early this morning, was by giving concessions that basically loaded the gun that now these same congressmen are going to be able to hold to his head. So, all that to say, every now and then we'll talk about stuff like that, but today and over the next couple months, I want to concentrate on this lifespan revolution. And I like finding images from the world of art. I found two that I thought spoke very well to the overall themes. This is Titian's The Ages of Man. It's actually got a different title as well. But as you will see, one of the central ideas that I think frames this course, and here Titian chooses youth, maturity, and elderhood. I think we would probably prefer an image of a child, but Titian was painting at a time when childhood was seen as devoid of value, and so not worth representing. And on the other hand, elderhood was seen as dignified, and so as you can see, the man here is perhaps gray and grizzled, but he's still presented as quite a character, I guess I'll say. And we, in a sense, maybe if we were painting this painting today, would do it the other way around, which is to say, put a lot more emphasis on childhood. And this is one of the things that is most photographed, most catered to in our culture and society. And we have de-emphasized elderhood as being important. But this has led us, I think, to be inadequately attentive to the fact that we are in the middle of this revolution in which not only are human beings living much longer than they have in the past, but as a result, our society is getting older, right? And that's a purely descriptive.
Excuse me, David, I
Yes.
have to protest. There is absolutely no representation of women in all of that.
In Titian, absolutely. That's in part why I've got Klimt, right? And I can't really apologize for Titian, but what I tried to do was to find an artist who actually primarily emphasized women in his art to supplement that. But point taken, yes. And so it's not just the disparagement of childhood, it's also the misogyny of the way in which Titian represents the ages of man. The title is revealing, right? And with Klimt, I think we get actually a fuller representation here, right? We have the infant, we have youth, we have the mother, we have also the mature couple, and more elderly woman. And so yes, I take the point that obviously, in a sense, women live longer and make up more of the population of the elderly in the world and in our country. And so we should absolutely be paying attention to their experience as well. What I want to focus on in these lectures is different dimensions of this issue. And I've thematized justice, care, and ethics. And so a just society takes into account all of its members and their needs, and we are inadequate in our capacity, in our focus, in our legislation, and also in our modes of thought when it comes to taking care of those who are living longer. And also, there's an ethical dimension to this. And so ethics, if it's distinct from justice, refers to the idea of not what we owe each other, but how we lead our lives so as to spend them well or appropriately. What should we do with our lives is the central question of ethics. And here the issue is, of course, that we are now adding another 20 or 30 years to our lives without really thinking through how can we continue to contribute? What is the meaning and value associated with this additional chapter in our lives? And as it turns out, as I will demonstrate, the period that we're referring to as elderhood is longer than the period of childhood. We spend an awful lot of time and energy thinking about schooling and learning and maturing and growing. We spend very little time thinking about what are the aims, the purposes, the values to be realized in that last part of life. And so this is the focus of these lectures. And I want to spend part of today setting them up and then part of today introducing one central theme. So I want to start by talking about both the demographic and the personal context in which I'm deciding to focus on this topic. And so the demographic, I hope justification for this course is reasonably clear. One thing to notice is that when we look at the US Census data, the category of 85 or older at the beginning of the 20th century is so insignificant that it doesn't actually enter the data, right? It's not a meaningful statistical category at the beginning of the 20th century. The group from 65 to 84 is an infinitesimally small proportion of the population. And so essentially the two big demographic groups recognized by the Census Bureau at the beginning of the 20th century are children and adults, 0 to 17, 18 to 64. And as we progress through the 20th century, as there are breakthroughs in medicine with antibiotics and vaccines, and then breakthroughs with nutrition and sanitation, indoor plumbing, refrigeration, which vastly reduced the amount of food poisoning, and generally speaking, as we become a wealthier society, a less agrarian economy with the risks associated with children working in the fields at a young age, we begin to see the lifespan extended and then the demographic categories shift. And so we are now to the point where almost 20% of our population, it doesn't show, I think, adequately in this diagram, but it is 17.7% of the population is 65 or older by the time we get to 2020. And as you can see, that's going to keep going up till the point where we get to 2060. And that means that we are in the midst of a vast demographic shift. That's one reason to start thinking through these topics. Previous societies and cultures are built around the assumption that the distribution of persons across ages looks a lot like it looked at the beginning of the 20th century. And our society doesn't look like that, and it's going to look less and less like that. The personal motivation for this has to do with the fact that I have been teaching classes to people who are in this age demographic category for over 20 years now. I got a grant from New York State to start doing this 22 years ago as a study, and it turns out both that I liked doing it and the people I was doing it with liked me doing it, and it's become one of the most rewarding things that I do. But I have to say that I've done it in a sense primarily intuitively as a teacher without having spent a lot of time studying or thinking through all of the aspects of what I'm going to call cognitive care, right? And so one of the things that we're going to think about together in these lectures is that human beings require care, right? And that is something that is true across the entire lifespan. My partner right now is sick and I am caring for her. And even when we're both perfectly healthy, we still care for each other, whether that's cooking or displaying love or providing emotional support or professional advice. Human beings require attention, love, affection, physical and emotional support from each other. But there are two of the three periods of a human lifespan, if you divide it in the way that I've just suggested, childhood, adulthood, elderhood. And as you probably recognize, following Ruth Aronson, who I'll be speaking more about in a little bit, in dividing the human lifespan into those three main phases, that childhood and elderhood are periods with greater needs for care. And so I'm beginning to think through what I do with you and what other people who are in the field of lifelong learning do as a form of cognitive care and to think through that category. And so I've actually got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and I'm going to be doing some research on this. And this is the preliminary stages to perhaps get a little bit deeper in my understanding of what I do when I give classes like this. And so that's my personal motivation. Why are we in the middle of a lifespan revolution? And again, this is just really simple background stuff. And I think there are two reasons, and I think it's important to notice that one of them is a long-term, what they call secular trend. It's likely to continue. And the other is in fact more circumstantial, but nevertheless is going to affect us for the next 20 to 30 years. So the long-term trend is that people are living older. And I was talking with you before we actually started about what you see when you look at the last major pandemic and the sharp drop in life expectancy that it caused. And I think we are fortunate that we are now in a world of much better vaccination. And so the COVID virus pandemic has not caused that kind of sharp drop in life expectancy. It has shaved a little bit off of life expectancy. But as you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, and this is right already partway through the lifespan revolution, Americans were living around 45 to 50 years on average, right? And I'll be as clear as possible. The earlier figures, 30 to 40 years, which is what humans have lived for most of human history, really dragged down by infant and childhood mortality, right? If a child doesn't make it to 10 years old, that drags the whole average down considerably. By the time we get to this period, childhood mortality, infant mortality has really begun to decline with advances in medicine. And now we're seeing antibiotics, vaccination, cancer treatment, better treatment for high blood pressure, heart attacks, better understanding of nutrition, sanitation, refrigeration, all of that contributing to this clear long-term trend. And by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, the first decade of the 21st century, women are living 80 years old, men 75. That gap, by the way, is closing. So that's one big thing that's generating the lifespan revolution. The other big factor.
David?
Yep, I'm listening. Go ahead.
The definition of life expectancy, is that how for people born in year X, what their life expectancy is, or of people living now? How is that defined?
Yeah, so there's two different
officially.
yeah, two different factors or two different metrics, I guess I should say. With the data we were just looking at, that's actually measuring lifespans, right? So what is the age of death on somebody's death certificate? And you can average that out, right?
Yeah, okay.
Whereas the earlier diagram looking at the projections for 2060, 2050, 2040, that is a projection based on advances in medicine, nutrition, et cetera, for currently alive people. So two different ways of thinking about it. Does that help, Anne?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So let me jump back in then. Unless, are there any other questions at this point? Nope. Okay. So I will jump back in. And so the second big factor here is the baby boom. And I hope you can see this diagram is from 1960, right? And so in 1960, the vast majority of our population is, I shouldn't say the vast majority, but the largest proportion of our population is from 0 to 15 years old. 0 to 20, yeah, also quite large. And this is the so-called baby boom, right? This is the large number of children who came of age in the aftermath of World War II, with the soldiers returning, in the aftermath of the Great Depression with much greater financial security. And these are people who are now still very much making their way through our population. So this wide number of people has gone up through the age range. Some of these people are now in their 80s or their 70s, and they will continue to move up and continue to swell the ranks of people who are older in our society for at least another decade. So that's the first aspect of this. The second aspect of this has to do with care. And one of the people I'm reading for this, Ajahn Poo, MacArthur Fellow, an organizer of care workers, I think puts it very nicely when she says, you can pay people who care, but you can't pay people to care. And I used the example of myself and my partner and the care of an intimate within my own household. And obviously that's unpaid care labor. And there has been a long-standing assumption that that's the way care is managed in our society. And the result has been that the provision and distribution of care have been either privatized, right? That is to say, it's a private matter. It's not something that public policy has to attend to, or just entirely marginalized and neglected. And of course, there's a gendered as well as a racial dimension to this, that the majority of this labor has traditionally and culturally, we're getting an echo. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone again. Sorry. Traditionally been assigned to women, and it's been considered unpaid labor, or to the extent that it is paid labor, it has been assigned to racial minorities and immigrants. It is therefore often considered to be low compensation and low prestige labor. And I think it's quite clear there's some rhetoric that attaches great importance and significance to this labor. But when it comes to the actual compensation of it, it is one of the least well paid forms of work in our society. And that is directly related to this historical prejudice that suggests that it's private, voluntary, unpaid labor, typically or ideally or normatively. One of the books I'm reading on this says, well, if you want to be well cared for, and then they look at the demographic profile of the people who are living at home in their 70s or 80s and 90s and seem to be well cared for. No signs of stress around their care regimen. They say, well, the best thing is to have three daughters or daughters-in-law who live within 10 minutes of you, right? And obviously, and the data back this up, that's a increasingly unlikely scenario. This is in part because we're having fewer children, right? So in the 1920s and 1930s, only 10% of our population was childless, or 10% of women were childless, and fully a third had four or more children, right? And so perhaps could rely on their children to care for them. When we get to the post-baby boom generation, 1950s, 1960s, we see a doubling of the number of women who decide not to have children. And literally, there's almost a 75% reduction in the number of women who have four or more children, right? So simply relying on the family to provide care isn't going to work. And I'll get into the geography of this in a moment, but right, the additional factor there, right? Three daughters or daughters-in-law who live within 10 minutes of you, right? And the other thing we're seeing is that we are a society of demographic mobility. People have to go where the work is, where the opportunity is, where their spouse wants them to go. There are a variety of reasons, but people are not staying necessarily close to where they grew up or where their parents continue to reside. If anything, there's more of a trend for elder parents to now move to where their children are. And so in addition to, right, children not being able to provide the care, the spouse is less likely to be able to provide the care because more marriages are ending, right? And as this data shows, right, the rate of divorce in 1970 meant that only 3 to 4, 5% of men and women were divorced in this period, and today, right, it's up to 15 or 20%. And I think one of the things to notice here is actually women tend to remarry less than men do. And so we'll get into that in a moment. This is the geographic data, and we have a interesting uneven distribution of people in our society by age. Actually, the West Coast is the youngest, along with Alaska in the United States. And this is a fairly recent trend. In particular, the fact that people are leaving the Midwest, which has some of the oldest demographics in the country, for other places when they are young, typically when they reach age to go to college or to take their first job. They leave and they don't return. And so there's a actual geographic distributional problem here. And then to just state without belaboring something that I think is relatively obvious, in your elderhood, you require more care, typically, right? This is not uniformly true. There are certain things that are uniformly true with aging. We lose muscle mass, we lose some bone density. We therefore are perhaps less capable of carrying heavy things and doing physical labor around the house than we have been in the past. But it is also the case that many people see their vision and their hearing decline. Some people develop forms of cognitive impairment. Some people develop other forms of physical incapacity. We put all of this together, and it's clear that those who are, right, in their 70s and 80s require greater care, and yet we have a social issue here. How are they going to get that care if it's not going to come through the private provision by their family members? So that's one of the fundamental issues that I want to start discussing with you. In addition to that, we can spend a moment thinking about a slightly different issue. And that is that, and you can see this, I think it's quite interesting, right? Percentage of men and women in the labor force, 1967 to 2017. And I pointed out to you last week that there's actually a contraction of laborers over 50 post COVID. So this may be changing again, but you can see that in the 1970s and 80s, the trend was for people to retire earlier, leave the workforce earlier. And this has to do with greater financial security provided by Medicare and Social Security, savings and pensions. And that as we've become a more precarious society, the number of people working into their 70s has gone back up, not quite to where it was in the 1960s for most groups, but it's getting very close. I do think there's a second factor going on here as well, which is that we have made age discrimination illegal, unconstitutional, and at the same time, the norms around working into our late 60s and 70s or even our 80s have changed so that people no longer feel that they have to leave a job that they like or they want to continue in or that they attach meaning or that they like the rhythms of, um, just because they've reached 65 years old. And this presents an issue, I think, in a sense, in the other direction. And we have to remember, right? We think about the sandwich generation, the generation who is simultaneously taking care of children and their parents, right? And pulled in two different directions. This imposes burdens if we don't handle this correctly as a society, not only on those who are in their elderhood, but also on adults. It may even strain the capacity of the adults to take care of their children. And similarly, with regards to this, there's this phenomenon sociologists refer to as generational turnover, right? You can think about this in my field, in academics. When is it that the old guard surrenders their leadership and the young guns come along and begin to assume those positions? If people are staying in work longer, are they, in a sense, forestalling opportunity for people who are younger? And does that create a distributional problem? So I do think that there are not just concerns with justice to the elderly or for the elderly, but justice for the society as a whole that go unaddressed as long as we are not clearly confronting this issue. And so this is another aspect of this. And again, I think this is very important. The ratio of working age adults to older adults, right? In 1960, that's 6 to 1. It's part of the reason that people in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 1980s, could retire with securities because there was a lot of money in the Social Security and Medicare pools to fund their retirement. But as you can see, with each passing decade, that ratio has shifted to the point where it's almost half of what it used to be in 2020. And as we move out into the coming decades, it will continue to decline, though not as rapidly, to the point where we get to around 2.5 working age adults per retired or older adult. And that ratio is going to make it difficult to sustain social support for a just distribution of care. in our society. So now let me just provide a little bit more information. I know there's a lot of words on this slide. I'll go through this pretty quickly. Some of the obvious social challenges, right? And we start with the idea that the number of Americans ages 65 and older will double from 52 million, or nearly double, in a few years ago to 95 million by 2016. So their share of the population will increase from, and I think it's already 17% now, to nearly a quarter of the population. And then there's this idea of aging in place, which sometimes means just staying in your home, but also may mean staying in your locale and your geographic location when other people, your children, and your natural support system moves away. Life expectancy, as we've seen, is increasing, and will continue to increase. The gender gap in life expectancy is actually narrowing, and the poverty rate for older Americans has dropped sharply, so that it was nearly 30% and now it's less than 10%. But there are genuine economic disparities across racial groups for those in their elderhood, as there are for every other age of life, especially for Latinos and African Americans. More older adults are divorced, and so, right, they can't rely on their life partner for care necessarily, in addition to having difficulty getting care from their children. And when we look in particular at women, right, a quarter lived alone in 2018 who were 65 to 74. This jumped to 40% in the 75 to 84, and 55% in the group that is 85 and older. And I will just say, and it's not happy news, but when I read someone like Ruth Aronson, who's a geriatrician who does home visits, some of what she shares about these older, especially women living on their own, is harrowing. And I'll immediately say, I teach in a community where one of the people who attends my lectures on a regular basis is a 93-year-old woman. She's obviously living in an independent care facility. She still drives. She retired as a high school French teacher in her 70s, and then went to law school, got a law degree, and started practicing law, which is what she is still doing today at 93. And so, you can be in your 80s or 90s and be pretty much self-sufficient. But the fact that that's a possibility does not mean that's something we should take for granted. So we could have a 50% increase in the number of people who require nursing care by the time we get to 2030. And this will obviously be quite expensive, and the demand for elder care is going up rapidly, right? So these are just basic social facts to help us to understand a little bit better what's going on with the lifespan revolution. I want to, as you might guess, given my background and my interest, focus on the normative, the moral, the ethical, the issues of justice as well. And so let me start with the ethical. What does it mean to age with dignity and meaning across all phases of life? That's, I think, a really important question. And I think it's one that ageism and neglect of elderhood have led us to not pay sufficient attention to, right? If we think that childhood is a period of developing capabilities, play, growth, creativity, that adulthood is a moment of social contribution, building a career, doing a job, raising children, getting a family, saving for later, right? We have clear associations with those phases of life in terms of the value, the meaning, the constructive activity. But if, as I will try to show you now, a quarter, a third of the human lifespan is in this third phase, elderhood, and we don't have clear goals, aims, value, meaning associated with it, we are doing ourselves a serious disservice. And this is something that many individuals are beginning to address for themselves on their own, but it is also something that our culture should be assisting us in thinking through. What is required both individually and socially to fairly and with dignity provide the special care that the elderly often require, right? And this is a distinct problem. If we can't privatize this, if it's unjust, unfair, and unworkable to assume that this will just take care of itself because it's not happening and won't happen, then we've got to treat this as a problem of distributive justice. How can we get this work done in a way that is fair to the people who do it, as well as the people who receive the care that they provide? So the organization and distribution of care labor doesn't adequately reflect the lifespan revolution or the transition to a highly mobile and less traditional society. And this has a lot to do with ageism. And we'll get more into this, but ageism is a very peculiar form of discrimination. And it's peculiar not only in the sense that many of the books I've been reading on this show, it's broadly tolerated in our society. So various books I've been reading will quote from the New York Times or Time magazine or a news broadcast the things that are said about old people and point out that they are using demeaning stereotypes, insulting language preconceptions that if they had said something similar about African Americans, Latinos, immigrants, or women, they would not have been allowed by their editors to get it out to the public. Or if they did get it out to the public, then there would have been a scandal, right? Hannah is asking, what's the definition of ageism? Ageism is prejudice against those who are 65 years or older. And here I use 65 as an arbitrary indication of when this period in life begins. But another way to put this would be discrimination against those who are considered to be old or elderly. And I think the other peculiar fact of ageism is that it is, for almost everyone, discrimination against their future self, right? At least we all hope that we're going to live long enough to be the victim of the discriminatory attitudes that we hold right now. And more than that, if we internalize those attitudes, as most of us do, then we end up dreading getting old and perhaps not pursuing the valuable opportunities that could be pursued later in life because of the negative attitudes we have about that phase in life and what that phase in life is like. And so I do think there's actually an opportunity in thinking through the discrimination against the elderly to perhaps address other forms of discrimination as well, because this is a form of discrimination that all of us eventually, in a sense, hope to be victims of, and so perhaps can identify with more than other forms of discrimination. There's a line in Ruth Aronson's Elderhood where she says, the medical profession is dedicated to keeping us alive, but we all dread getting older. There's something amiss here, right? And so in particular, the isolation of those deemed elderly from the rest of society is one of the real difficult problems that we need to think through in addressing ageism. So then the issue with the organization and distribution of care labor, people who do this as work for a living, right, is deeply structured by traditional inequalities and prejudices with to do with age, but also with gender, immigration, and race, given the demographic profile of the people who tend to perform care labor. And so this raises the question again, can we fairly distribute, as Shakespeare put it, love's labor of caring? And then uh, the issues of justice about how to productively incorporate while respecting and caring for those who are living longer than we have in the past. The other thing that is motivating me to teach this class is the fact that there's and I'm punning a little bit, mature literature on these issues. So I just threw on the carpet and took a quick picture of the books that I'm reading. I've mentioned Aronson's Elderhood, Daniel Levitin's book on successful aging takes this from a neuroscientific perspective, and I'll say more about this in the weeks to come. But we've discovered, I think, in ways that have really profoundly transformed our understanding of the brain, that neuroplasticity, the ability to make new neural connections and networks, goes much later in life than we realize. And so one of the questions then is how to continue to learn or to maintain cognitive capacity later in life. And that's, I think, a really important, interesting topic. And then in addition to the neuroscientific, there are really important psychological aspects to this. And so I'm going to talk with you soon about Ellen Langer. Some of you may know her as, among other things, the person who made the idea of mindfulness so important in contemporary psychology, the idea that is of a kind of meditative practice in which one pays attention to the content of one's consciousness. And in a famous study from I think, early 1980s, Langer did something fascinating. She took a group of elderly men, and yes, it was, I believe, all men in their 70s and 80s on a retreat. She took them to a resort, and she had the resort set up so that everything in the resort was from 20 to 30 years earlier, the newspapers, the magazines, the books, but also what was on the televisions themselves being black and white and not color. They watched a World Series from 30 years before and had movie nights and played the kind of board games that people were playing when they were in their prime. And she had done a battery of physiological and psychological tests on these individuals before the retreat. The retreat lasted a week. At the end of the retreat, she redid those tests, and she found on average that spending a week in an environment that reminded you of the prime of your life took roughly 10 years off the age of these men, in the sense that they walked faster. They actually had greater lung capacity. They had less complaints about pain or other forms of degenerative deterioration. And their memory and cognition worked better. And so when I say we need to overcome ageism, and that doing so is important to having functional and valuable elderhoods, it's not just about the attitude that others have about us. It's about the attitude that we have about ourselves. Becca Levy, another important contemporary psychologist, in her book, Breaking the Age Code, um, uh, speaks in a sense in very much the same vein as Langer about how your self-conception actually shapes your sense of your capacity, your ability, your potential. And then some of this other literature, which I won't go into all the details, but helps us to think through the way in which philosophy, literature, anthropology helps us to see the meaning, the value, the productivity that can accompany later stages in life. And then finally, a lot of literature about justice and democracy and care that helps us to think through the ways in which society have to meet our changing demographics halfway by changing the infrastructure of care and support for the elderly. So I'm going to do this, I hope, in roughly 7 weeks. Like I say, I will pause whenever politics or other things in the world demand our attention. But today, I'm kind of introducing things, and with a little bit of luck, I'll have a moment or two to talk about Aronson's work. And then I'm going to talk a lot about the mind and the way in which our self-conceptions, our mental habits, the way in which we think about aging and the potentials that face us in our elderhood, as well as the liabilities and difficulties, shape the way we approach this phase of life. And then the kinds of meaning and activity that are available to us later in life. And then finally, the politics and the distribution of care fairly and with dignity. So, as I say, I wanted to speak with you for at least a moment about Ruth Aronson. And Ruth Aronson, I think some of you may know, is a San Francisco native who has spent her entire medical career at UCSF, with the exception of a few years at Harvard Medical School. She is a leading geriatrician. And just to give a little bit of a sense of her book, Elderhood, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, many people compare it with the work of Oliver Sacks, and that she gives both a kind of memoir structure to it. She structures the work around the phases of her own life, but then shares many anecdotes, stories, narratives of the people she's treated as a geriatrician from the 1990s to the present. It was published in 2019, so it's quite recent work. But just to give you a sense of Aronson being a leading geriatrician, in the early 1990s, when she started doing research on this, she was invited to give a talk at a major medical conference on dementia. That was the field she was researching on, before she had passed her medical boards. And she said she felt like an imposter, right? All these other people were senior in her profession, and here she was fresh out of medical school giving this talk. But it was because the topic was so neglected. And this is one of the things I learned from her book, which I think is really fascinating. And Ruth is sharing that she actually spoke with you, the book is in your library. Fantastic. Yeah, and I know she's a Bay Area treasure of sorts. So I'm glad to hear that. And you got to hear it straight from her. I'll do my best to do justice to her work as well. But one of the things that I learned from her work is that in the United States, the field of geriatrics was not taught in medical school until the late 1970s. And she thinks that this failure of American medicine to take geriatrics seriously is indicative of ageism, that people did not see the need to do this, to have a special field of medicine, because they simply associated growing old with disease and decline. As a matter of fact, there is a long tradition in medicine, as she documents, in treating age as a disease, right? This is rejected, obviously, by contemporary medicine, but nevertheless, that prejudice continued to direct people away from taking geriatrics seriously, to such a degree that it wasn't even taught in medical schools, and it continues to be seen as one of the low prestige, low compensation, less scientific and rigorous fields within medicine. And she tries to indicate that this is a huge blunder and costly mistake by the medical profession, in part because, as she puts it, the body of somebody who is 70 or 80 years old is as different from the body of somebody who's 30 or 40 years old as is the body of somebody who's 10 years old, right? And so the idea that we have pediatrics and that we have distinct medicine and protocol and do distinct trials and tests for children, but don't do it for the people who are 70 or 80 years old or older, she thinks is incredibly problematic, and why geriatrics needs to be a distinct field, because older bodies have different metabolisms, different chemistries, and therefore different reactions to drugs and treatment than do younger bodies. They need to be subject, therefore, to different care regimens. And she also thinks that geriatrics faces a problem more squarely than the rest of American medicine, which is the problem that you shouldn't just be treating and managing diseases, but you should be trying to determine what people want from their lives, and then devising a regime of medical treatment to help them attain their health goals. That geriatrics, when it's practiced well, does that, and that much of American medicine fails to do that. So that's just a little bit of an introduction. Let me for today just give one more. I think it's really the central framework, the theoretical idea of Aronson's book, and it's represented in a single diagram. And this diagram suggests, and I think it captures it quite graphically, that if we divide the human life into three main periods: childhood, adulthood, elderhood. The divisions are obviously imprecise, but if we use 20 years old as the transition from childhood to young adulthood, if adulthood continues roughly to when you're 60 years old, then actually, given the lifespan revolution, now many people spend longer in their elderhood than in their childhood. But we have a field of medicine that's very well developed for childhood without a comparable field of medicine for elderhood. We have a whole network of social institutions: pre-K, K, school, SATs, college admissions, sports, music instruction, gymnastics, all kinds of activity focused on cultivation of capability in childhood, and very little focus on using elderhood to realize meaning and value. One more thing to recognize about this diagram is that there is a other dimension, right? The vertical dimension, as opposed to the horizontal dimension, which refers to age, refers to the degree of independence or dependence. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think this is more cultural and normative than absolutely physical or always true, but that we associate adulthood with independence, and many adults are actually fully capable of being completely independent, but obviously children and those in their elderhood are not. And so this then sets part of the parameters of the problem that we have to think about when we think through the lifespan revolution. We have a second and growing segment of our population that we cannot expect to be fully independent, that we therefore need to make provisions for their needs and dependencies, and yet we are not doing that very well. All right, I'm curious to hear what you think. Obviously, this is a different topic than anything I've spoken with you about before. It's a topic that I know some of you have a little bit of firsthand acquaintance with. What do you think? Flossie, start us off. Unmute yourself, please. You're still muted, Flossie. You got to hold the space bar down.
Okay,
Yes.
all right.
Flossie, are you holding the space bar down? It's muted again.
We have to face the possibility that there can be death with dignity. So while we're thinking about not being able to do enough to keep the elderly alive and functioning, there comes a time when one has completed that cycle and would like to leave without waiting, and that medicine has not provided. If I want to die in 6 months because I'm ready, I have to have a disease that will kill me in 6 months. Otherwise, I have to invite hostage, that I'm calling it hospice, but it's hostage, so that I can decide not to eat. I can decide all kinds of ways of not living, when it would be so easy to have a party and to take a pill and to say farewell. But that's not permitted, because only the good Lord decides when you have to go, and you ain't the good Lord.
Yeah, and so there are religious reasons that euthanasia is not as widely available in California as maybe it is in some other states, and certainly not as widely available in the United States as it is in some other countries. But there are also some ethical concerns about the abuse of the availability, the legal sanction or of let's see who's screen share am I seeing? Anyway, Bonita, who is Bonita? If you can take that down, that would be great. But there are concerns, for instance, that people who will feel that they're a burden on the previous generation, and if there's a possibility of getting access to an easy way to end your life, some people will do it, not really because they want to end their life or they feel they've completed their life, but they're worried about being a burden on others. Now, the actual studies of this in societies that have euthanasia, not just for the terminally ill, but for those who have decided that they are ready to end their lives, suggest that this kind of thing doesn't really happen and that it's pretty easy to set up safeguards for it. I'll just mention very quickly, Flossie, that there's a group you may be aware of called the Hemlock Society that actually does try to assist people in doing this who do want to do it. Bob, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how this relates, but I've been active with Third Act,
Yes,
who does all that stuff. And one of the points that they always make is that people over 60 control, and that's not the right word, 70% of the wealth. in
Yeah,
this country.
yeah.
And like I say, I don't know how that factors into any of this, but it certainly is an interesting statistic.
Yeah, and I've spoken with you a little bit about third act before, because of our ongoing discussions of climate change and the question of activism on the part of people who are further along in life. And one of the things that third act is encouraging people to do is to use their wealth, their financial power, to force banks to stop funding the extraction of fossil fuels, right? And so yes, I think, and I want to be as clear as possible. I spoke about the baby boom being this kind of big demographic swelling of our population, and as it has moved through each phase of life, it has changed our society and its institutions. And as the baby boom becomes now in their 70s and 80s, it is entirely possible that they will become much more powerful politically at this age than people have been in the past. So yeah, Bob, I like the idea. And you know, one of the things that got me thinking about this is the question: should Joe Biden run again, right, as a president who would finish his term in his late 80s? And so would this be maybe an effort on his part to overcome the ageism of our society by exemplifying activism, energy, efficacy later in life? Let's see, Dorothy has pointed out that the Hemlock Society is now known as Final Exit Network, and has been for a while. And so I guess I'm out of date in terms of my nomenclature there. Thank you, Dorothy. So Final Exit Network. Anybody else for today? Does this seem like a good and interesting theme to be thinking about together for a while? I'm seeing some thumbs up. I appreciate that, Renee. Joan, thank you. Good.
Yes.
Well, and we can take it 1 week at a time. But I'm going to be doing some research on this. I always love sharing my ideas with you guys. I think we can have some fun. And boy, you guys certainly, I'm sure, will have lots of information from me as well. So be safe, have good weeks, take care. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.